Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Newcomb. Joe Biden became the 46th President of the United States, promising to restore its leadership on the international stage and rebuilding its relationship with allies. And President Biden is expected to seek better coordination with U.S. allies, South Korea and Japan, in pursuing denuclearization of North Korea, as the regime continues to be a major challenge for the new U.S. government. We'll discuss these and more. Joining us is William Newcomb, fellow at the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. He was a member of the panel of experts on North Korea sanctions at the United Nations. He also served as deputy coordinator of the U.S. State Department's North Korea Working Group. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He's a senior fellow for Korea Studies and director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
In his inaugural speech, President Biden mostly focused on the need for unity among Americans. He very briefly touched on foreign issues, saying he will seek to repair America's alliances and global leadership. So, Mr. Snyder, he has reaffirmed that he's going back to the traditional path of foreign diplomacy, hasn't he?
Yeah, I think that the Biden administration really wants to turn back the clock to the status quo ante. He wants to restore U.S. leadership. We can see evidence of that in the return to the climate change agreement and U.S. rejoining WHO. But I think the challenge that the Biden administration faces is that the world has changed and the U.S. has changed. And so I think the question is, how will the U.S. efforts to provide global leadership be greeted or challenged by the world? And then can the U.S. sustain international leadership in the face of enormous domestic challenges?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Newcomb, working with allies closely, does this mean a return to working level talks in dealing with North Korea, turning away from the top-down diplomacy we have seen during the Trump administration?
Well, I would anticipate resumption of track 1, 1.5, and track 2 talks should North Korea agree to participate so it can learn more about the new Biden administration, its players, its plans, and explore possible options while it continues to seek sanctions relief as it has over the past 4 years. I think we're going to see more bottom-up, very little top-down. But at the same time, should lower level talks create an opportunity for potential breakthroughs, I wouldn't rule out President Biden stepping in at an appropriate time. But I think you would have to have some deals pretty soundly in place before he made that kind of political commitment.
A number of his cabinet nominees took part in confirmation hearings in the Senate. Biden's Secretary of State nominee, Antony Blinken, said the Biden administration will review the country's entire approach and policy toward North Korea. Mr. Newcomb, do you think it means that the Biden team will withdraw some of what the Trump administration did?
I certainly would hope that they not only look at what the Trump administration did, but they would also go back as far as agreed framework and take an unflinching look at the sequence of policy failures that have dogged our efforts to get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles. And, we really need to broaden our targets. They have pretty sophisticated chemical weapons perfected in Syria in actual use. They have they pose a terrific cyber threat and do a lot of cyber thefts. And we have the human rights issues too. So we have a lot more things to address than just what has been the sole focus of all these past years.
Right. And Mr. Snyder, your thought on this?
Well, I agree with Bill. I don't think that the Biden administration is going to pursue any kind of anything but Trump approach. I think that they will review what worked and what didn't. But more importantly, I think that they have to look at where North Korea is and where North Korea is saying it wants to go. And so I think the messages from the Eighth Party Congress are going to be very important, and additional actions that North Korea takes in the coming weeks will be important in shaping the approach of the Biden administration.
Blinken also said the North Korean issue is a problem that has not gotten better, but in fact gotten worse. Mr. Snyder, is it really so?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the case that it's gotten worse. We saw the tests from 2017, but since then we see just this year North Korea's expression of intent to continue in developing the submarine-launched ballistic missile capability. We see an emphasis on developing tactical nuclear weapons, possibly for battlefield use. And the big issue I think that the Biden administration faces is whether or not Kim Jong-un and North Korea are going to redirect a shift in intentions. We saw that symmetry was successful in inducing some measure of restraint and expressed intent by North Korea. But now North Korea has gone back to this formulation of hostile policy, and they've expressed that that hostile policy is unending. And so in the context of that formulation with regards to perceptions of U.S. intent, it raises some big questions about what North Korea's intent is going to be going forward.
Mr. Newcomb, if it has really gotten worse, why is that the case? Is it because the effect of sanctions has worn off?
Not exactly the right way to characterize it. I mean, first, I think Anthony Blinken is spot on about this increased difficulty. We've got escalating threats, and one that people fail to mention very often is we have a threat of renewed proliferation. You have to recall that North Korea committed the worst acts of proliferation ever when it built the nuclear reactor in Syria that Israel destroyed. It also was helping Libya when Gaddafi had his nuclear program going on. And so the concern now is, will it resume this kind of activity? Would it even entertain proliferation to non-state actors, which has always been, I think, a very grave concern when looking at the North Korean threat. It's not just missiles flying toward U.S. possessions or the U.S. mainland. It's a much bigger issue than that. So when we get to sanctions, they're the most important tool at the disposal of the international community to address this in a peaceful way. I mean, that's why sanctions exist. That's why Article 41 precedes Article 42, which authorizes the international community to use force to address threats to international peace and security. So sanctions need to be, in my view, more fully enforced. And they never really were. We have a tool that we have failed to utilize to its maximum effect. And if you look at more recent reports by the panel of experts, they have documented exhaustively a number of violations, and they have named and shamed the people that did it. But what consequences have there been? Probably no more than a New York City parking ticket issued to a diplomat.
Mr. Newcomb, just to follow up on what you said, in order for the new Biden team to persuade North Korea to come out to the talks, should they pursue strengthening sanctions then?
Well, I think they're going to do both. I anticipate, based upon Biden's request to review what needs to be done about COVID-19, I anticipate that we might see some kind of relaxation of sanctions in order to help address these kinds of issues, avoid putting populations at risk with this pandemic or others that may follow, and similar sorts of issues. So I expect we're going to see some well-crafted expansion of the exemptions. I don't expect any relaxation in the kind of tougher sanctions that target North Korea's export earnings and so forth. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I really hope that this review is able to identify places where it's useful to discuss things with the North, as well as cut off their avenues of evasion in the networks that support it.
Mr. Snyder, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I really see the sanctions regime as attempting to achieve three distinct objectives. One is denial of North Korea being able to gain materials that it needs in order to pursue its nuclear and missile programs. That's going to remain in place, although I think that's debatable how successful we've been. The second is sanctions as an instrument of punishment, and that also, I think that's the most sensitive part. That's clearly the part that Kim Jong-un responded to in Hanoi. And it's also the area where you can imagine that distinguishing humanitarian aid intended for the people of North Korea from targeting the leadership is important. And then the third dimension is sanctions as an instrument of leverage in a negotiation process. And that's the part that really has to be thought through very carefully in terms of how one thinks about sanctions lifting in the context of moving forward as part of negotiations. And it's really the reason why I think that it's unlikely we're going to see premature sanctions lifting because sanctions is perceived as leverage in the context of any interaction with North Korea that might be required in order to move forward on denuclearization.
And now the Democratic Party controls 2 houses of U.S. Congress, although rather slimly. The U.S. Congress often showed in the past a nonpartisan consensus on its stand on North Korean issues. Mr. Snyder, do you expect that the pressure on North Korea will strengthen under the Democratic-controlled Congress?
Well, I think there's going to be continued skepticism of North Korea in Congress. I think that there may be more reflexive opposition to whatever the Biden administration does on North Korea from the Republicans in Congress. And in a way, the really interesting development is the emergence of a small group in Congress that believes that we should focus on peace rather than denuclearization. This is the progressive wing within the Democratic Party. But I do not see that group as having any real significant influence at this stage in shaping the Biden administration's policies toward North Korea.
Mr. Newcomb, your thought on this? Is there a possibility that we would see some support from the Congress for the engagement with North Korea?
Well, I would hope so. In fact, when the new policy is being developed, I would encourage those who are looking into these issues to involve Congress at a very early stage, because I think bipartisan congressional buy-in is going to be crucial over the longer term in developing any kind of policy that would have a hope of success. If we go back to agreed framework, recall that Congress didn't support it. Congress didn't fund it. And that meant that the people in Cato had to go around internationally with their begging bowl to get the money for the LWRs, right? That kind of situation has changed dramatically. We now see Congress passing legislation. In part, it passed legislation because the prior administration wasn't doing enough in their view. In part, it passed legislation to address some glaring human rights abuses. So Congress has put a marker on these issues.
Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, South Korean President Moon Jae-in has picked Chung Eui-yong, former Director of National Security at Cheongwade, as his new foreign minister. It was announced just hours ahead of President Biden's inauguration. And of course, he's known for playing a key role in Seoul and Washington coordination, especially in realizing the historic summit between the US and North Korea. Tapping Chung Eui-yong as a foreign minister is seen as President Moon pushing for talks between the US and North Korea. Mr. Newcomb, will this work?
I don't think so. I'm sure that you're absolutely correct that he was put in position to rally support from the new Biden administration toward President Moon's efforts to, restart some kind of peace talks and other issues with the DPRK. But with the policy review needing to be done first, I don't expect any kind of near-term progress on gaining that kind of support, other than maybe some rhetoric. I think in time, once the U.S. and the ROK consult, and again, I expect that to happen also in the policy review process, just like I expect consultations with like-minded countries, Japan and those in Europe. But I don't expect anything new. And I don't anticipate a full-throated support of whatever the ROK is pushing.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, President Biden has made clear that he will only meet North Korean leader Kim Jong-un when there is a progress in denuclearization, which means he will leave much work to the professional diplomats. Is there any room for South Korea to play the role of an intermediary in this?
Well, I think that South Korea's ability to play an intermediary role depends almost completely on whether or not North Korea is willing to use South Korea as an intermediary. And under current circumstances, it doesn't look like Kim Jong-un is really inclined to do that. We see a lot of effort on the part of South Korea to place itself as an intermediary, but I actually think that what the U.S. wants more than South Korea as an intermediary is South Korea as a partner. And the scope of that partnership, I think, from the perspective of the United States, is not solely focused on North Korea. It also involves a set of expectations for alliance cooperation on a whole range of issues. So I think it's important for the South Korean administration under Moon Jae-in to recognize that it really has a comprehensive role to play, and that North Korea is not the only problem facing the world.
And my last question today is about North Korea's biggest challenge, which is the economy. The regime has pledged to carry out its new 5-year economic development scheme. Mr. Snyder, how serious is the situation in North Korea right now?
Well, I'm not sure that we understand in as great a detail as we need to, but I think that what's clear is the Eighth Party Congress admitted a whole range of failures, and it doubled down on self-strengthening, which is an inward-focused policy. We've seen evidence of exchange rate volatility. I think there may be problems in the internal distribution system in North Korea. And actually, that's of great concern because it's in part what led to the famine in the late 90s. Domestic agricultural production may be a little bit more stable. But it really is, I think, one of the big questions, and I actually think that it's going to be looked at very carefully as part of a policy review to determine whether North Korea's economic weakness could provide an opening for diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Newcomb, with sanctions in place, can North Korea really weather through this?
If we go back a couple of years, we see North Korea sort of coping with sanctions. We see a fairly stagnant, perhaps very low growth rate economy from year to year. Some years with a little success, other years with a little bit of failure, but sort of navigating along in very difficult circumstances. But the response to COVID-19 was to put a blockade on themselves. And they turned this fairly stagnant economy into one that would experience a very steep decline in economic growth. That would give you an indication of what North Korea might experience should global sanctions be more widely implemented and more rigorously enforced. And even if North Korea were tomorrow to remove its troops from the border, open them back up, try to reestablish trade, the problem is that they've imposed this blockade so long that trade relationships have become dislocated. And it's going to be difficult to repair the damage that's already been done inside the North Korean economy, right? So even if they removed it, while they will get sort of a short-term response, I mean, I would liken it to what the stock market calls a dead cat bounce, where you get an immediate response, but it's not sustainable. And so in the presence of global sanctions that inhibit North Korea's acquisition of industrial plant and equipment, spare parts, raw materials, and cut it off from markets of potential exports, I think any chance of reestablishing some kind of vibrant economic growth is next to none.
Well, in the meantime, former U.S. Ambassador to South Korea Sung Kim has been appointed Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. The appointment of the veteran diplomat is closely watched as it could signal the Biden team's willingness to restore the traditional diplomatic path in the Indo-Pacific region. Mr. Newcomb and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Young-Yo.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And it was nice to see you, Scott.
Likewise.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.